Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. Look, look at the size of this book. So with two essays, it comes to something like 900 pages. So I think altogether just a little under 900 pages. And when I first started reading this, I talked to my friends who'd majored in political science, and I said, "Did you ever read Democracy in America?" All I ever got was, "We read extracts." But I couldn't find anyone who'd ever read all of Democracy in America. But it is frequently quoted. It's one of those texts that you feel like you've read because people have talked about the ideas in it so much. But I was so pleased to read the text in its entirety, and it only vindicated an idea that I've had for some time, which is if you want to learn a lot about a country, ask a foreigner who spent some time there. That it's sometimes hard for a native-born person to describe who they are because so much of the way that a certain people live and think and breathe and talk and worship is taken for granted. So they can't step away and say, "Oh, we do this because." You have to push them in conversation, and then they think about it and say, "Yeah, I think that's right." But part of it comes from an alien observation. And that's what de Tocqueville based this book. So you're thinking, how did he read all this? It was all based on 8 months in America that he spent. He then took his notes and whatever English he had learned to make it around the country, went back, wrote this, and it's a triumph. It's a text that still resonates today. There are a couple things that de Tocqueville gets wrong in his predictions. However, there's so much that he gets right that you don't really think about that. And the book is very wide in its compass. So you'll see him talk about relationships between men and women, the way that the government is structured, the question of the frontier, question of slavery, question of Indian relations, religion. De Tocqueville gets deep into the heart of who Americans are at this time, this pushing forward, this restlessness. And it's something that I think is very much still with us as Americans today. We have this restlessness, this rootlessness, this seeking something better, not entirely certain why we're seeking something better. We're just seeking something better. It's a variation on what I see with Singaporeans. They're in a hurry. They don't know where they're going, but they're in a hurry to get there. And I ended up, what I do when I finish a lot of books is I will take some of my favorite quotes and I'll put them in my Goodreads review. In the case of this, the quotes came to 17 pages in a Google Doc. That's how many I ran into. There are so many times when I would read something and I think that is so true. And how did de Tocqueville get this? He didn't get it from conducting polling, doing research. He just went around, he made observations, he tied those observations together, and then he shared some conclusions. And as I say, those conclusions were mostly right. And there are definitely some zingers in there. In fact, I have the document. I'm going to read some of these quotes for you. One of them is, "Do not invite an American to speak about Europe. He will usually display great presumption and a rather ridiculous arrogance. He will merely express those vague and general ideas which, in all countries, are such a comfort to the uneducated." Definitely true. And I say this, I think, for my fellow countrymen who haven't lived in Europe. So I think they don't get a real notion of, even if they've visited for a long time, if they haven't lived, you don't have to have lived here a long time to get, but let's say anything more than 2 or 3 weeks, I think you can really start to get a sense of a place. But if you're only here for a week or two, it's hard to really have ideas about a place that matter. And there's an example of that. I'm just sort of randomly scroll through this document and pick out some ideas. Men involved in trade will eagerly latch on to all generalizations presented to them in philosophy, politics, science, or the arts without looking at them closely, but will accept those pertaining to commerce only after close scrutiny and then with reservations. So here he's hitting on a theme of business and commerce as the great pastime of Americans, that this is something that we're more obsessed with than other things. It doesn't mean that we're not involved in arts or science or sport or other things, but that commerce is the great driver of American civilization, and it is what drives the majority of the population. I think that's true when he wrote it in the 1800s, and it's true today. Some things haven't changed for America, and that's an example of one of them. Here's another one. Europeans pay much attention to the wilds of America, but Americans themselves scarcely ever think about them. And there's a story here with me that I did not become as devoted to the U.S. national parks until I moved to Europe. And it happened because my European friends would tell me or ask me, Stephen, have you been to Yellowstone? Stephen, have you been here? And I thought, no. And I lived in the U.S. for 20-some years of my life. And I was so ashamed by my European friends who'd come to America for its great, what I consider the greatest national treasure of America is its national parks. They had flown to America, gone and visited these places, came back, told stories. And I, who had lived there, I'd never gone. And so I very much took a conscious, intentional effort to do that. And I've seen more national parks in the 10 years that I've lived in Europe than in my 20 years of living in the U.S. And I've probably been to, on pace, maybe 2 national parks a year, trying to maybe catch up and make up for lost time. But I do think this was mitigated recently. I think during the pandemic, people started to get a bit more of a sense for the treasures in our own backyard because they were forced to stay in the U.S. They couldn't travel as much, and they thought, wow, we really do have these great. There was also a couple television series that were produced highlighting the national park. So I think the national parks are entering a golden era of awareness, but the problem then is they will start to be more crowded because they aren't built necessarily to accommodate extremely large crowds. And I think the more Americans find out about them, there's this paradox of how do we share this great treasure, but also keep the experience a good one for everybody and do so in a sustainable, regenerative way. I think that's going to be a question. But I do think de Tocqueville's quote is still true, that Europeans do understand the treasures of America and that Americans scarcely pay attention. However, I do think that's changing finally, a couple hundred years after de Tocqueville wrote this. What else? I'll give you one more quote, and then I'll conclude the review. If I say to an American that the country he lives in is beautiful, he answers, "True enough, there is not its like in the world." I admire the freedom enjoyed by its citizens, and he answers, "Freedom is indeed a priceless gift, but very few nations are worthy of enjoying it." Finally, I leave him to his self-contemplation. But he comes back at me and refuses to leave me until he has prevailed upon me to repeat what I have just said. A more intrusive and garrulous patriotism would be hard to imagine. It wearies even those who respect it. And here is de Tocqueville pointing out the religion of America as the greatest country that has ever been and will ever be. That in 1830, when de Tocqueville is writing this, Americans had this spirit. And they still have it today. Not only is it factually incorrect and impossible to predict that no other country in the history of the world will be as great as the United States. The U.S. has been around a very short amount of time. We're talking hundreds of years. We're not talking about thousands of years. And it has revealed itself to have so many problems in even the last 10 years, becoming ungovernable as a country in many respects, that the idea that, freedom is owned by America, it's trademarked by America, we are the defenders of freedom everywhere, when the irony is, we're oppressors in many places where we pretend to be freedom fighters. That even then, de Tocqueville saw this self-defeating, delusional sort of patriotism. He says, it wearies even those who respect it. And as Americans, we would just benefit from a closer look at our history, a more realistic expectation of what a nation is supposed to give us. It's not supposed to be our religion. It's not supposed to be this all-encompassing force in our lives. It's simply supposed to be part of our lives, part of who we are. It's not supposed to be everything. And de Tocqueville, I think, having come from especially a France that had been rocked by revolution, had recently had a restoration, and de Tocqueville was probably having his illusions taken apart post-Napoleon and the rise of the nephew, that we would do well to realize if we tie our value, our worth as a people to a form of government, what happens when that government falls. And I'm not saying that the American government is going to fall today, tomorrow, or whenever, but at some point it will. All governments do. And that doesn't mean that the people fall. The people and the government are separate ideas. And I think that that's one of hundreds of wonderful ideas and thought trails you can go down from reading this. Now, I do want to point out, this is a book of political science. It is not a narrative. It's not something that's going to be an easy read. But I think it will be a very rewarding read. I think it's essential reading for Americans. I think if you're an American, you need to read this book. If you are a foreigner who's very engaged and interested in America, which I've come to meet many people around the world, I should stop being surprised when I meet such people, but I think part of me still always is that there are people who are so engaged and interested in America. This would be essential reading for you as well. It's not an easy assignment, but I think, as I say, it will be a rewarding one. If you'd like to buy this book, there'll be a link to it in the description below. You can support my work by buying from that link. You can also support my work by subscribing to my Patreon, which is also linked below. And if you don't want to buy the book, if you don't want to subscribe to my Patreon, you can still hit like, you can still subscribe to the channel, you can still forward this video to people who you think might be interested in this text. Until next time, enjoy your reading.